my little one.
He's a happy little cowboy.
He certainly is.
The dust from the stagecoach settled slowly as it disappeared into the distance, leaving behind a lone figure on the wooden platform of Cedar Ridge Station. Thomas Garrett stood motionless for a moment, his weathered hands gripping a small canvas bag that contained everything he owned in the world. The uniform he'd worn for 5 long years had been traded for simple civilian clothes. Worn denim pants, a cotton shirt that had seen better days, and boots that had walked through more battlefields than any man should see in a lifetime. 5 years. 5 years since he'd kissed Sarah goodbye on this very platform, promising to return before their first anniversary. 5 years since he'd held her close and whispered that he'd come back to build the life they'd planned together. The war that was supposed to last a few months had consumed half a decade of his life. And now at 32, Thomas felt like an old man carrying the weight of 1,000 ghosts. The memories flooded back as he stood there. Sarah's tears as the train had pulled away, her final wave from the platform growing smaller until it was just a speck in the distance. He remembered how confident he'd been then, how certain that this was just a temporary separation, a brief interruption in their planned life together. They would have children, he told her. A boy first maybe to help work the land, then a girl with Sarah's green eyes and gentle nature. They would grow old together on the small ranch he'd inherited from his father, watching their grandchildren play in the same fields where he'd run as a boy. Cedar Ridge looked smaller than he remembered, though perhaps that was just the perspective of someone who had seen too much of the world. The main street stretched out before him, dusty and familiar, lined with the same wooden storefronts and hitching posts that had been there when he left Miller's General Store. The Brass Lantern Saloon, Doc Peterson's office with its painted sign still hanging at a slight angle. Everything was the same, yet somehow different. As if he were looking at a photograph of a life that had belonged to someone else, Mrs. Henderson was sweeping her front steps, just as she'd done every morning for as long as Thomas could remember. She looked up as he passed, squinting in the bright afternoon sun, and he could see the moment when recognition dawned on her weathered face. Her broom clattered to the ground, and she pressed both hands to her mouth, staring at him as if he were an apparition risen from the dead. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Thomas Garrett, but we thought you were dead," Thomas finished quietly. "I know there was a mistake." Word would spread quickly now. Within the hour, everyone in Cedar Ridge would know that Thomas Garrett had returned from the grave. He could already imagine the conversations that would take place over dinner tables tonight, the shock and confusion and difficult questions that would arise. But most of all, he could imagine the conversation that would have to happen between him and Sarah. Thomas began walking toward the edge of town, where the small house he'd built with his own hands waited. Each step felt heavier than the last, weighted not just with exhaustion, but with an anticipation that bordered on fear. He had written letters during the first 2 years, but the mail service had been unreliable, and eventually the chaos of war had made correspondence impossible. He had no idea if Sarah even knew he was still alive. The war years played through his mind like a series of vivid nightmares as he walked Bull Run, where he'd first seen men die, and realized that war was nothing like the glorious adventure he'd imagined. Antietam, where the creek had literally run red with blood, Gettysburg, where he'd watched his best friend die in his arms, and where he himself had nearly joined the countless bodies littering that Pennsylvania field. The field hospital where he'd awakened with no memory of how he'd gotten there, his identification lost somewhere in the chaos. The long, terrible months in the prisoner of war camp where men died of disease and starvation while waiting for a war to end that seemed to go on forever. He had survived it all, though he wasn't always sure why. There had been nights when he prayed for death, mornings when he'd wondered if God had simply forgotten about him. The only thing that had kept him going was the thought of coming home to Sarah, of holding her again, of picking up the threads of the life they'd planned together. The house came into view as he crested the small hill that overlooked the valley. It was exactly as he'd left it. White clapboard siding, green shutters, a small porch with the rocking chair he'd made for Sarah's birthday. Smoke rose from the chimney and warm light glowed through the windows. His heart began to pound as he realized that someone was home, that Sarah was there, probably preparing dinner just as she used to do. But as he drew closer, Thomas noticed things that made his steps falter. There was a horse tied to the post outside, a fine bay gelling that he didn't recognize. The animal was well cared for, its coat gleaming, its tack expensive looking. Not the kind of horse a widow struggling to make ends meet would own. Children's toys were scattered across the front yard. A wooden horse, a small wagon, a rag doll with yellow yarn hair. The garden that Sarah had tended with such care was larger now, more elaborate, with vegetables and flowers that spoke of years of patient cultivation. Thomas crouched behind a large oak tree at the edge of the property, his soldier's instincts telling him to observe before revealing himself. Something wasn't right here. The house looked too prosperous, too settled, too much like a family home rather than a widow's cottage. Children's laughter floated through the evening air, high and sweet, followed by the sound of a man's deep voice. Thomas stopped dead in his tracks, his blood turning to ice water in his veins. There was a man's voice coming from his house. His house, where his wife should be waiting for him. He crept closer, moving with the stealth that 5 years of warfare had taught him, staying low and using the trees and bushes for cover. As he approached the front window, he could hear the conversation inside more clearly. A man telling some sort of story that was making a child giggle with delight. A woman's voice offering gentle corrections and additions to the tale. Thomas peered through the window, and the sight that greeted him hit him like a physical blow to the chest. Sarah stood at the stove stirring something in a large pot, her auburn hair pinned up in the same style she'd always favored. She looked older, more mature, but still beautiful in the way that had first stolen his breath 7 years ago. Her figure had filled out slightly, the way a woman's does after bearing children, and there was a contentment in her movements that spoke of happiness and security. But she wasn't alone. A tall man with dark hair and broad shoulders stood beside her, his arm around her waist in a gesture of casual intimacy that spoke of long familiarity. He was handsome in a clean-cut way, well-dressed in the manner of someone who worked with his mind rather than his hands. Thomas recognized him now. Henry Morrison, who had run the bank before the war and had always been sweet on Sarah, even after she'd married Thomas, and sitting at the table was a little girl, perhaps 3 years old, with Sarah's green eyes and the stranger's dark curls. The child was giggling at something the man had said, clapping her small hands together in delight. She was beautiful, this little girl, with rosy cheeks and bright eyes and all the joy that innocence could hold. "Tell it again, Papa," the child demanded, bouncing in her chair. "Tell about the princess and the dragon." "Papa," the word hit Thomas like a bullet to the chest. This child, this beautiful little girl with Sarah's eyes, was calling another man, Papa, and Henry, for it could only be Henry, was looking down at her with the unmistakable love of a father, reaching over to ruffle her dark curls with gentle affection. "Emma, sweetheart, Papa's told that story 3 times already," Sarah said, her voice warm with laughter. "Why don't you help Mama set the table instead, Emma?" The child had a name, a place in this family, a life that had nothing to do with Thomas Garrett. She scrambled down from her chair and began carefully placing tin plates around the table, her tongue sticking out slightly in concentration as she tried to get everything just right. Thomas felt the world tilt around him. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of nightmare, a fever dream brought on by the long journey and too many memories. But the scene remained stubbornly real. His wife, another man, a child who couldn't possibly be his. Sarah was laughing now, leaning into Henry's embrace as he whispered something in her ear, looking more content and at peace than Thomas remembered her ever being with him. "Dinner's ready," Sarah announced, and the little family gathered around the table Thomas had made with his own hands in the house he'd built for the woman he'd married. They joined hands to say grace, and Thomas could see the gold wedding band glinting on Sarah's finger. But whose ring was it? His or Henry's? Thomas stumbled backward, his legs suddenly weak, his vision blurring. This was wrong. This was all wrong. Sarah was his wife. They had been married in the little church just down the road, had planned a life together, had dreamed of children who would bear his name. How could she be here in their house with another man's child looking as if she belonged there? The rational part of his mind tried to make sense of what he was seeing. Sarah had been told he was dead. He understood that much from Mrs. Henderson's reaction. In the eyes of the world, she was a widow free to remarry and start a new life. He couldn't blame her for moving on, for finding happiness where she could. But understanding it intellectually was different from watching it unfold before his eyes, from seeing the woman he loved in another man's arms, raising another man's child. Thomas didn't remember walking back to town, but somehow he found himself sitting on a bench outside the saloon, staring at nothing, his mind reeling with questions that had no good answers. The sun had set completely now, and the street was lit only by the warm glow spilling from windows and the occasional lantern. People passed by, some nodding and greeting, but most not recognizing the hollow-eyed stranger who had once been their neighbor. The saloon doors swung open, releasing a burst of noise and light and the smell of whiskey and tobacco. Thomas considered going inside, drowning his sorrows in alcohol the way soldiers often did when the memories became too much to bear. But he'd seen too many good men destroyed by drink, had watched them trade one kind of hell for another. Whatever he was going to do about this situation, he needed to face it with a clear head. Thomas Garrett. The voice belonged to Jim Wheeler, who owned the livery stable and had been one of Thomas's closest friends before the war. Jim had always been built like a scarecrow, tall and thin with knobby joints and a shock of red hair that never wanted to lie flat. The warriors had aged him, adding lines to his face and gray to his hair, but his smile was the same warm, welcoming expression Thomas remembered. "My God, man, is that really you? We all thought you were dead." Thomas looked up slowly, his eyes focusing with effort on Jim's concerned face. "Dead," he managed to croak, his voice rusty from disuse. Jim sat down beside him on the bench, his expression a mixture of joy and confusion. "The telegram came 3 years ago. Official notification from the War Department said you'd been killed at Gettysburg, that your body had been identified by another soldier from Cedar Ridge, Billy Patterson. Remember him, Sarah?" Well, Sarah grieved for the longest time. We all did. The whole town turned out for the memorial service. How are you here? How are you alive? 3 years ago, the battle at Gettysburg had been a nightmare of smoke and blood and screaming horses, and Thomas had indeed been left for dead on that field. He'd awakened in a Union hospital with no memory of how he'd gotten there, and no identification to prove who he was. The doctors had done their best to piece together his injuries: a severe head wound that had left him unconscious for weeks, a bullet through the shoulder, various cuts and bruises from being trampled by cavalry charges. It had taken months to recover from his wounds, and even then, his memory of the battle remained fragmentary. When he'd finally been able to tell them his name and unit, the records showed that Thomas Garrett of Cedar Ridge had already been officially declared dead. It had taken nearly a year to straighten out the paperwork, and by then he'd been transferred to a prisoner of war camp where he'd spent nearly 2 years before finally being released when the war ended. "There was a mistake," Thomas said simply, his voice barely above a whisper. "The telegram was wrong. Billy Patterson must have been confused. There were so many bodies on that field, so much chaos. I was wounded, taken prisoner. I had no way to get word to anyone." Jim's face went pale as the implications of what Thomas was saying began to sink in. "Oh, Thomas, oh God, Sarah, you need to know she remarried about 18 months ago to Henry Morrison. You remember Henry ran the bank before the war. He came back last year with a fair amount of money. Bought the old Jameson place, fixed it up real nice. He and Sarah, well, they have a little girl together now. Name's Emma." The words hit Thomas like bullets, each one finding its mark with devastating precision. Remarried 18 months ago, a little girl, Emma, the child he'd seen through the window. The child with Sarah's eyes and another man's features had a name now, had a father who wasn't him, had a life story that began long after Thomas Garrett had supposedly died on a Pennsylvania battlefield. "She mourned you proper," Jim continued, his voice gentle with sympathy. "Wore black for a full year. Wouldn't even look at another man. Wouldn't hear of selling the house even when things got tight financially. Said it would be like betraying your memory. But Henry, he was patient with her and eventually. Well, people need companionship, Thomas. People need to move on with their lives. She thought you were dead. We all did. Thomas nodded mechanically, but he wasn't really listening anymore. His mind was trapped in that moment at the window, seeing Sarah in another man's arms, seeing the easy intimacy between them that spoke of shared nights and whispered conversations and all the small moments that make up a marriage. She had replaced him, had taken another man into their bed, into their life, into their future, had given birth to another man's child, and was raising that child in the house Thomas had built for their own family. The wedding was real quiet, Jim continued, seeming to feel that the silence needed to be filled with details, no matter how painful. Just family and a few close friends. Sarah didn't want anything elaborate. Said it didn't feel right to celebrate when she was still wearing your ring next to the new one. But Henry understood. He's a good man. Thomas treats her well, loves that little girl like she hung the moon. And Sarah, well, she's happy, really happy. Maybe for the first time since you left. Each word was like another nail in the coffin of Thomas's old life. But he forced himself to listen, to understand the full scope of what he'd lost. It wasn't just Sarah he'd lost. It was the entire future they'd planned together, the children they would have had, the life they would have built. All of that belonged to Henry Morrison. Now, where are you staying? Jim asked. You can't just sit here all night. Come stay with Martha and me until you figure out what you're going to do. We've got plenty of room, and Martha would love to see you again. She always said you were the brother she never had. But Thomas was already standing, already walking away. He had no destination in mind. He just needed to move. Needed to put distance between himself and the knowledge that his life, the life he'd fought to return to, no longer existed. He walked through the dark streets of Cedar Ridge, past the church where he and Sarah had been married, past the creek where they used to walk on Sunday afternoons, past all the places that held memories of a happiness that now felt like someone else's dream. The church held particular ghosts for him. It had been a perfect spring day when he and Sarah had exchanged vows, the air sweet with the scent of apple blossoms and the sound of birds singing in the trees. Sarah had worn her mother's wedding dress altered to fit her smaller frame, and Thomas had worn the best suit he could afford, a simple black outfit that had cost him 3 months' wages. But Sarah had told him he looked like a prince, and he had felt like one standing there in front of God and the entire community, promising to love and cherish this amazing woman for the rest of his life. Reverend Mills had performed the ceremony, speaking about the sacred bond of marriage, about how what God had joined together, no man should put us under. Thomas wondered what the good Reverend had said when he'd married Sarah to Henry Morrison. Had he mentioned the previous marriage? Had he struggled with the theological implications of a woman taking a second husband while her first still lived? Or had he simply been grateful that one of his parishioners had found happiness again after so much grief? The moon was high by the time Thomas found himself at the edge of town. Sitting on a fallen log beside the road that led to the neighboring county, he pulled out the one photograph he carried, a small tintype of Sarah taken just before their wedding. In the picture, she was young and radiant, her eyes bright with love and hope for the future. She wore a simple white dress, and her hair was arranged in the elaborate style that had been fashionable then. Her hands were folded in her lap and she was smiling. Not the posed, formal expression common in photographs of the era, but a genuine smile of pure joy. He stared at that face for a long time, trying to reconcile it with the woman he'd seen tonight. The woman who had looked so complete in another man's arms. The Sarah in the photograph belonged to him, had loved him, had promised to wait for him. But the Sarah he'd seen through the window belonged to Henry Morrison, had borne his child, had built a life with him that seemed fuller and richer than anything she'd ever shared with Thomas. A sound made him look up, the soft clop of horse hooves on the dirt road. A rider was approaching, moving slowly in the moonlight, and as the figure drew closer, Thomas saw that it was a woman. His heart stopped as he recognized the graceful way she sat in the saddle, the familiar silhouette that had haunted his dreams for 5 long years. Sarah pulled her horse to a stop just a few feet away and sat looking down at him, her face pale in the moonlight. She was wearing a simple blue dress and a dark shawl, and her hair was loose around her shoulders the way she used to wear it when they were courting. Even in the dim light, Thomas could see that she was more beautiful now than she had been as a young bride. Maturity had added depth to her features, and motherhood had given her a serenity that made her seem almost luminous. "Jim Wheeler came by," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "He told me you were alive, that you'd come home." Her voice was exactly as he remembered it, soft and musical, with just a hint of the southern accent she'd inherited from her grandmother. Thomas stood slowly, his legs unsteady beneath him. Sarah, they stared at each other across the small distance that separated them, and Thomas could see the tears glistening on her cheeks. She looked older than in his photograph, more mature but still achingly beautiful. Still the woman he'd fallen in love with all those years ago. The woman who had occupied his thoughts through 5 years of hell. "They told me you were dead," she whispered, her voice breaking on the words. "The telegram came from the War Department. It said you'd been killed at Gettysburg, that your body had been identified by Billy Patterson. I waited for weeks for them to send you home for burial, but they said there wasn't enough left till she couldn't finish the sentence." But Thomas understood. In the chaos of that terrible battle, with thousands of bodies littering the field, many men had been buried where they fell, their graves marked only by rough wooden crosses that the weather would soon destroy. Sarah had been told that Thomas was among them, reduced to a name carved into rotting wood in an unknown corner of Pennsylvania. "There was a mistake," Thomas said again, the words feeling more inadequate every time he spoke them. How could such a simple phrase encompass all the confusion and misidentification and bureaucratic incompetence that had stolen 5 years from their lives? "I was wounded, taken prisoner. I had no way to get word to you. When I finally got home, when I finally made it back here," he gestured helplessly toward town, toward the house where she lived with another man and another man's child. Sarah dismounted and took a step toward him, then stopped, her hands twisting in the fabric of her shawl. "Thomas, I don't know how to say this. I don't know how to explain what's happened. I saw," he said simply, "I saw your husband, your daughter." The words hung between them like a physical thing, heavy with all the pain and confusion and impossibility of the situation. Sarah's face crumpled and she covered it with her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "I waited," she finally managed to say through her tears. "I waited for 2 years, Thomas. I wore black. I mourned you. I visited your grave every week. The whole town thought I was losing my mind. The way I clung to your memory, but everyone said I had to move on, had to build a new life." I was 25 years old and completely alone in the world. She looked up at him then, her eyes bright with tears and something that might have been desperation. Henry was so kind, so patient. He never pushed, never made me feel like I owed him anything. He was there when I needed someone to talk to, someone to help me with things around the house. And eventually, I realized that I cared for him, that maybe I could love him in a different way than I loved you. Thomas felt something twist inside his chest, a pain that was worse than any physical wound he'd endured during the war. And Emma, Sarah's expression grew soft, and Thomas could see all the fierce love of a mother in her eyes. Emma is innocent in all this. She's just a baby who needs her parents, who doesn't understand why the world is suddenly so complicated. She calls Henry Papa because that's all she's ever known. She's never heard of Thomas Garrett. The words hit him harder than any battle charge. Emma, the little girl with Sarah's eyes and Henry's curls, didn't even know he existed in her world. Henry Morrison was the only father she'd ever had, the man who told her bedtime stories and taught her to ride a horse and would walk her down the aisle someday when she married. "She's not my daughter," Thomas said, the words coming out harsher than he'd intended. "No," Sarah whispered, "she's not." They stood in the moonlight. Two people who had once shared everything now separated by circumstances that neither of them had chosen or could easily undo. The silence stretched between them, filled with all the words they couldn't say, all the hurt that had no easy remedy. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked finally, her voice small and lost. Thomas had been asking himself the same question since the moment he'd seen her through the window. In the eyes of the law and the church, Sarah was still his wife. Their marriage had never been officially dissolved, had only been interrupted by his supposed death. But in every way that mattered, she belonged to someone else now. She had made a life with Henry Morrison, had borne his child, had woven herself into a new family structure that had no place for a ghost from the past. I don't know. He admitted the honesty of it burning in his throat. I honestly don't know. Sarah took another step closer, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she'd always favored. Could see the tiny freckles across her nose that had always made him smile. Her proximity was both a comfort and a torture, a reminder of everything he'd lost and everything he could never have again. I loved you, she said, her voice breaking with the weight of the past tense. I loved you so much, and when I thought you were dead, I wanted to die too. For months, I could barely get out of bed in the morning. I stopped eating, stopped taking care of myself, stopped caring about anything. The whole town was worried about me. Thomas could picture it. Sarah wasting away with grief, refusing comfort from anyone, clinging to memories of their brief time together. The image of her suffering made his chest ache with guilt and regret. But Henry helped me heal, she continued. He helped me remember how to laugh again, how to see beauty in the world. And Emma, Thomas, Emma is my heart now. She's given me a purpose, a reason to get up every morning and be grateful for the gift of another day. I can't abandon her, I won't. I'm not asking you to, Thomas said quietly, and he meant it. Whatever else had happened, whatever complicated mess they found themselves in, he would never ask a mother to abandon her child. I would never ask you to leave your daughter, but what about us? What about our marriage? The question hung in the air between them, and Thomas realized that he already knew the answer, had known it from the moment he'd seen Sarah in Henry's arms. Some things couldn't be undone. Some changes couldn't be reversed. The war had taken more from him than just 5 years of his life. It had taken his future, his family, his place in the world. There is no us anymore, he said, the words tearing at his throat like broken glass. There's you and Henry and Emma, and there's me trying to figure out how to live in a world that moved on without me. Sarah's tears were flowing freely now. And Thomas had to clench his fist to keep from reaching for her, from trying to comfort her the way he used to when she was upset about something. But he had forfeited that right when he'd supposedly died on a battlefield in Pennsylvania. He was no longer her husband in any way that mattered. I'm so sorry, she whispered, the words torn from somewhere deep inside her. I'm so sorry, Thomas. If I had known, if there had been any chance that you might still be alive, you would have waited forever, he finished for her, because he knew it was true. Sarah had the kind of loyalty that burned bright and constant, the kind that would have kept her faithful to his memory until she died of old age. I know, and that's exactly why I can't ask you to give up what you have now. You deserve to be happy, Sarah. You deserve to have a family and a husband who can be there for you, who can come home to you every night instead of disappearing into war zones for years at a time. They both knew that Thomas was right, but knowing it didn't make it hurt any less. The practical, rational part of Sarah's mind understood that her life with Henry was real and solid and good for everyone involved. But her heart was breaking for the boy she'd fallen in love with, for the dreams they'd shared, for the life that might have been if the world had been a kinder place. What will you do? She asked, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Thomas looked down the moonlight road that led away from Cedar Ridge, away from everything he'd once thought was his. I'll figure it out. Maybe head west, find work on a ranch somewhere, California maybe, or Oregon, start over where nobody knows my name or my story. You could stay, Sarah said desperately, though they both knew it was impossible. You could build a new life here. There are other women in town, other chances for happiness. Mary Bate Collins is still unmarried, and she always thought you were handsome, or Ruth Patterson. She's been widowed for 2 years now and could use a good man. But Thomas shook his head. The idea of staying in Cedar Ridge, of watching Sarah raise another man's child while he courted other women and tried to pretend that his heart wasn't buried in a Pennsylvania battlefield, was unbearable. I can't stay and watch you be happy with someone else. I'm not that strong, Sarah. I'm not that good a man. They stood in silence for another long moment, and then Sarah walked back to her horse and mounted. She looked down at him from the saddle, and Thomas could see all the love and regret and impossible yearning that he felt reflected in her eyes. I'll always love you, she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. Part of me will always belong to the life we planned together, to the man who built me a house and promised me children and rode off to war, believing he'd come home to me. And I'll always love the woman you were, Thomas replied, his own voice thick with emotion. The woman you were before the war changed everything, before we both became different people than we were when we made those promises. Sarah nodded, understanding what he meant. They were both different now, shaped by loss and hardship and the simple passage of time. The boy who had ridden off to war and the girl who had waved goodbye from the train platform no longer existed. In their place were two adults who had learned to survive in a world that didn't always offer happy endings. Sarah turned her horse back toward town, toward the home where Henry Morrison waited with their daughter, where a life that didn't include Thomas Garrett continued to unfold. But before she rode away, she looked back one last time. "If you ever change your mind about staying," she began. "I won't," Thomas said gently but firmly. "It's better this way, Sarah, cleaner. It'll hurt less for everyone involved if I just disappear." She nodded, accepting the wisdom of his words, even though it broke her heart to do so. Then she urged her horse forward and disappeared into the darkness, leaving Thomas alone with the stars and the ghosts of everything he'd lost. Thomas sat back down on the fallen log and stared up at the night sky. Somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, was a future he would have to build from scratch. It wouldn't be the future he dreamed of during those long years of war, but it would be his, and maybe if he was lucky, it would be enough. The next morning found Thomas at the livery stable, using what little money he had left to buy a horse and basic supplies for the journey ahead. The horse was an older gelding named Buck, not the prettiest animal, but sound and steady, the kind of horse that would carry a man a long way without complaint. Jim Wheeler tried to talk him out of leaving, offered him work at the livery and a place to stay with his family, but Thomas's mind was made up. He couldn't rebuild his life in the shadow of what he'd lost. Every street corner in Cedar Ridge held memories. Every familiar face was a reminder of the man he used to be. "At least let me give you some supplies for the road," Jim insisted, loading Thomas's saddle bags with jerky and hardtack and a small bag of coffee beans. "And take this." He pressed a $20 gold piece into Thomas's hand. "Don't argue with me. You'll need money to get started wherever you're going." As Thomas prepared to mount his horse and ride out of Cedar Ridge forever, he caught sight of movement down the main street. Sarah was coming toward the general store, walking hand in hand with little Emma, while Henry followed behind, carrying a basket of eggs to trade. They looked like the perfect family, mother and father and child, all of them healthy and happy and completely content with their world. For just a moment, Sarah looked across the street and met Thomas's eyes. The pain in her gaze was unmistakable, but so was her resolve. She had made her choice, had chosen the life that was real and present over the ghost of what might have been. Thomas touched the brim of his hat in a final farewell, a gesture that only Sarah would understand, then mounted his horse and rode out of town without looking back. The road west stretched out before him, dusty and uncertain, leading toward a future that he would have to build from nothing. Behind him, in the little white house with green shutters, the life he dreamed of continued without him. Sarah making breakfast for her family, Henry reading the newspaper by the fire, Emma playing with her toys on the floor. They would be happy, Thomas thought. They would be a real family in a way that he and Sarah could never be again. Miles later, when the sun was high and Cedar Ridge was nothing but a memory behind him, Thomas allowed himself to cry. For the woman he'd lost, for the life that would never be. For the young man who had ridden off to war 5 years ago, full of hope and certainty about the future. That man was truly dead now, buried not on a battlefield, but in the ruins of a dream that had crumbled to dust. But as the day wore on, and the road carried him farther from his past, Thomas began to feel something he hadn't expected, a strange kind of freedom. For the first time in 5 years, he was truly free to choose his own path to become whoever he decided to be. The war was over, both the one between North and South and the one in his own heart. He was 32 years old, still strong, still capable of hard work and new beginnings. By evening, he had reached the next town, a rough frontier settlement called Willow Creek, where no one knew his name or his story. The saloon was crowded with cowboys and drifters, men who had also left their past behind in search of something better. Thomas bought a drink and listened to their stories. Tales of cattle drives and gold strikes and land that was free for the taking if a man was willing to work for it. "You heading west?" asked a grizzled cowboy sitting at the bar. "Heard there's good money to be made in the cattle business if you can handle the work." Thomas nodded, downing his whiskey in one burning gulp. "That's what I hear." "Well, if you're looking for work, there's a spread about 50 mi north of here." The Double R Ranch owner's always looking for good hands, especially ones who know how to handle themselves in a fight. Indians been causing trouble lately. And rustlers, too. The cowboy's words sparked something in Thomas. Not hope exactly, but interest. The idea of working with cattle, of spending his days under the open sky, with honest work to occupy his hands and mind, appealed to him. It would be a completely different life from what he'd planned with Sarah, but it would be his own. He would stop here for supplies and maybe stay a few days to earn some traveling money, and then he would continue west toward the open range and the cattle ranches, in the vast sky that promised room for a man to start over. Sarah would always be part of him, would always live in the corner of his heart, reserved for first loves and impossible dreams. But he was done being haunted by what he lost. It was time to discover what he might yet find. The setting sun painted the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, and Thomas Garrett rode toward it with something that felt almost like hope stirring in his chest behind him. His old life faded into memory. Ahead lay whatever came next, uncertain but entirely his own to claim.